The air in the lawyer's office was so thick you could taste the greed. It hung heavy and stagnant, smelling of old leather, lemon polish, and the cloying, expensive perfume my stepmother, Evelyn, wore like armor. I sat on a stiff-backed chair that felt like it was carved from a single block of ice, my simple cotton dress feeling painfully out of place amidst the mahogany and tailored suits. Across the gleaming expanse of Mr. Albright's desk, Evelyn sat poised, a black widow in a Chanel suit, her expression a careful mask of somber sympathy that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Beside her, her son, my stepbrother Mark, shifted restlessly. He wasn't even trying to fake grief. His face was a canvas of undisguised impatience, his eyes darting from the grandfather clock in the corner to the thick manila envelope on the desk, the one that held my father's last will and testament, the one that was about to detonate my life. I'm so glad you're here to listen to this. Truly. Because for the longest time, I felt so utterly alone in this story. Like I was screaming into a void. If you're watching this, please, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I need to know how far my story travels, how many people out there might understand this kind of pain. My father, Richard, had been gone for a week. A sudden heart attack, they said. It was a shock, but not a surprise. He had lived his life like a freight train at full speed, acquiring businesses, assets, and a second wife with the same relentless momentum. I was a relic from his first life, his first love. My mother, Eleanor, had passed away from cancer 10 years ago, and with her went the warmth and light of our family. 2 years after she was gone, Evelyn arrived, and the house I grew up in slowly transformed into a cold, minimalist museum where I was no longer a welcome exhibit. I tried. God, I tried to connect with my father, to maintain that bond we once had. But every phone call was cut short. Every visit felt timed and supervised by Evelyn, who would hover with a saccharine smile and steer the conversation toward Mark's latest achievements. Mr. Albright, a man who looked as old and dusty as the books lining his shelves, finally cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the suffocating silence. He slid a pair of spectacles onto his nose and carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I wasn't naive. I knew Evelyn and Mark had spent the last 8 years weaving themselves into the fabric of my father's life, positioning themselves, securing their future. But a part of me, a small, hopeful, foolish part, believed that in the end my father would remember me, that he would remember the little girl whose scraped knees he bandaged, the teenager he taught to drive, the daughter who shared his love for old black and white movies. "We are gathered here today, Mr. Albright began, his voice a dry rustle of paper, to execute the final wishes of Richard Sterling." He droned on through the legal preamble, his words a meaningless buzz in my ears. I kept my eyes fixed on a small crack in the ceiling, tracing its path, trying to anchor myself to something real as the world began to tilt on its axis. Evelyn placed a perfectly manicured hand on Mark's arm, a gesture of shared anticipation. The will began with the small things: a watch to a business partner, a donation to his alma mater. Then it moved to the larger assets. To my beloved stepson, Mark Jennings, Mr. Albright read, "I bequeath my collection of classic automobiles and the contents of my investment portfolio, account number 74B291. Mark's chest puffed out. He shot a quick, triumphant smirk in my direction before schooling his features back into a mask of solemnity. It was a small, blink and you'd miss it moment, but it was a clear message. I've won. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The cars were my father's passion. We had spent countless weekends in the garage when I was a kid, the smell of oil and wax filling the air as he told me the stories behind each one. They were more than metal and leather. They were my memories. And he had given them to Mark, the lawyer continued, his voice unwavering. The property at 12 Aspen Lane, our family's summer cabin in Lake Tahoe, I leave to my stepson, Mark Jennings. The knot in my stomach tightened into a fist of ice. The cabin, that was my mother's favorite place on earth. It was where she and my father had honeymooned, where I'd learned to swim, where the three of us had been a real family. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was woven into the very fabric of my childhood. Evelyn had always hated it, complaining it was too rustic. And now, it belonged to her son. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My hands, clasped in my lap, were numb. This couldn't be happening. It felt like my father was erasing me, piece by piece, memory by memory. I risked a glance at Evelyn. Her mask had slipped. Her lips were curved into a faint, satisfied smile as she watched me, her eyes glittering with a cold, victorious light. She was enjoying this. She was savoring my pain. Finally, Mr. Albright reached the main bequeathment. All remaining assets, including my primary residence at 450 Bel Air Road, all liquid assets, business holdings in Sterling Enterprises, and the remainder of my estate, I leave in its entirety to my loving and devoted wife, Evelyn Sterling. Silence. A profound, deafening silence filled the room, broken only by the loud, relentless ticking of the clock. It was done. He had given her everything. The company he built from the ground up, the house I was born in, every last penny. It was as if I had never existed. I felt hollowed out, a ghost in my own life story. But surely there had to be something. A token, a memento, some small acknowledgement that I was his daughter, his only child. My breath hitched in my throat as I waited, praying for my name to be spoken. Mr. Albright took a slow breath and looked down at the final paragraph. He seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something pity, perhaps, in his old eyes before he continued reading. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple executioner of words. "And to my daughter, Clara Sterling," he read, and my heart gave a painful lurch of hope. He looked up at me over his spectacles, his face unreadable. He then read the last sentence my father would ever say to me. "I leave nothing." Nothing. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. It wasn't just an absence of inheritance, it was a statement, a final, brutal rejection. It was a disownment, delivered posthumously in a cold, sterile office, in front of the two people who had orchestrated it. The clock continued to tick, each second a hammer blow against the wreckage of my world. I couldn't breathe. The air had been sucked from the room, from my lungs. I saw Mark's shoulders shake with a silent, suppressed laugh. And Evelyn reached across the desk and placed her hand on mine. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. "I am so sorry, darling," she whispered, her voice oozing with a sympathy so false it was poisonous. "Your father, he was very clear about his wishes. But don't you worry. Mark and I will always think of you." I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I stood up, my legs trembling, the room swaying around me. I didn't say a word. There were no words. What could I say? I turned and walked out of the office, out of the building, and into the harsh, indifferent sunlight of the street, a fatherless, penniless ghost, with the sound of my stepbrother's laughter echoing in my ears. I had nothing left, or so I thought. The days that followed the reading of the will bled into one another in a gray, featureless fog of grief and betrayal. It wasn't the money, not really. I had my own life, my small bakery that I'd built with my own two hands, flour dust on my clothes, and a quiet pride in my heart. It was the absolute, crushing finality of that one word. Nothing. It was a slammed door, a turned back, a lifetime of love and memories declared null and void. I'd walk through my small apartment, catching my reflection in a window, and I'd see a stranger, a woman who was officially an orphan, not just by circumstance, but by decree. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the scene in the lawyer's office playing on a torturous loop. Evelyn's triumphant smile, Mark's cruel smirk, and the echo of my father's voice. filtered through a stranger, casting me out. I stopped answering my phone. I knew the calls were from well-meaning friends, offering condolences that felt like they were for a different kind of loss. How could I explain that I was mourning not one but two fathers? The one I had loved and lost to a heart attack, and the one who had apparently never really existed, the one who could, with a stroke of a pen, erase his only child. I felt a profound sense of shame, as if his rejection was a verdict on my worth as a daughter, as a person. I imagined people whispering, "Did you hear about Clara Sterling? Her own father cut her out completely. She must have done something terrible." Evelyn and Mark had not just taken my inheritance. They had stolen my good name, my history. About 2 weeks after that horrible day, I ran out of flour. It was such a mundane, trivial thing, but it was the first thing that forced me out of my self-imposed prison. I drove to the old house, the one that was now officially Evelyn's, to retrieve some of my mother's things. I had called Mr. Albright and he'd arranged it, a 2-hour window when Evelyn and Mark would be out. He'd couched it in legal terms, but I knew what it was. A supervised visit to my own childhood home. The thought was humiliating, but there were things in that house, my mother's things, that I couldn't bear to leave in Evelyn's possession. Pulling into the long, familiar driveway was like a punch to the gut. The rose bushes my mother had so lovingly tended were overgrown and neglected. The welcome mat she'd cross-stitched herself was gone, replaced by a sleek, impersonal slate tile. The house already felt like a stranger. I let myself in with the key I wasn't sure would still work, my heart pounding with a mixture of nostalgia and dread. The inside was even worse. Evelyn had wasted no time. My mother's warm chintz armchairs were gone, replaced by cold, white leather monstrosities. The family photos that had once lined the hallway had vanished, the walls now adorned with abstract art that felt as soulless as the house's new owner. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to find something, anything, that still held a trace of my mother, of the life we had here. I went straight upstairs to the attic. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and thyme, a comforting smell from my childhood. It was the one place Evelyn's sterile touch hadn't reached yet. Cardboard boxes were stacked high, labeled in my mother's elegant, looping script. Clara's school projects, holiday decorations, Eleanor's keepsakes. Author. It was this last box I was looking for. I carefully lifted the lid, my hands trembling. Inside was a treasure trove of my mother's life. Her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, her favorite book. A bundle of letters my father had written to her when they were dating. Her nursing school pin. I ran my fingers over each item, tears blurring my vision. This was who she was. She was love and warmth and kindness, everything this house no longer was. I sat on the dusty floorboards for what felt like hours, lost in memory, the afternoon sun slanting through the single grimy window. As I was carefully placing everything back in the box, my fingers brushed against something tucked into the lining of the lid. A false bottom. My heart gave a little skip. My mother had loved puzzles and secrets. It was a game we used to play. I worked my fingernail under the edge of the cardboard and pried it up. Tucked beneath it was a single, thick envelope. It was made of heavy, cream-colored paper, the kind she reserved for special occasions. My name was written on the front in her beautiful handwriting, "For my dearest Clara." But it was the instruction written beneath my name that made the air freeze in my lungs. To be opened only upon your father's death, and only if you find yourself in need of the truth. My hands started to shake. In need of the truth. What did that mean? She had written this years ago, before she passed. How could she have known? How could she have possibly anticipated the cold, cruel words in my father's will? It felt like a message from beyond the grave. A final, loving act from a mother who had seen the storm clouds gathering long before the rain began to fall. The house was silent around me, but my mind was screaming. What truth? What had she known? I clutched the envelope to my chest. It felt warm, heavy with unspoken words and secrets kept for a decade. I looked around the dusty attic, at the ghosts of my past, and then down at the letter in my hands, a key to a future I couldn't yet imagine. I had come here looking for a piece of my mother, and it seemed she had left me the most important piece of all. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my grief and confusion momentarily eclipsed by a spark of something else. Something I hadn't felt in weeks, a flicker of hope. I carefully placed the letter in my purse, gathered the box of keepsakes, and walked out of that cold, empty house, leaving the ghosts behind. I didn't know what was in that envelope, but I knew one thing for certain. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning. I didn't open the letter right away. For 2 whole days, it sat on my kitchen counter, a silent, potent presence in my small apartment. I'd circle it like it was a sleeping animal I was afraid to wake. Part of me was terrified of what it might contain. What truth could be so important that my mother felt she had to hide it, even from me, until after my father was gone? Was it a painful family secret? A confession? Another betrayal I wasn't sure my already fractured heart could handle? But another, stronger part of me knew that this letter was a lifeline. My mother had left it for me for a reason. She had anticipated my need, and in her infinite love and foresight, she had left me a map. On the 3rd night, I couldn't stand it any longer. I poured myself a glass of wine, my hand shaking slightly. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one where I usually kneaded dough and sketched out cake designs, and I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and felt important in my hands. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to plunge into deep, unknown waters, and I carefully broke the seal. Inside were several pages, filled with my mother's familiar, graceful script. The moment I saw her handwriting, a fresh wave of grief washed over me. It was so vividly her. I could almost smell her lavender perfume, hear her gentle voice. I started to read. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and your father is as well. I pray that your life is full of joy and love, and that this letter is nothing more than a curious relic from the past. But I am a mother, my love, and a mother's instinct is a powerful thing. I have to prepare for the possibility that you are reading this not out of curiosity, but out of need. I have to prepare for the possibility that the man I married is not the man who raised you to the end. My heart clenched. She had seen it. Even all those years ago, when she was sick and my father was the doting, grief-stricken husband, she had seen the subtle shifts in his character, the growing influence of his ambition, the seeds of the coldness that would one day bloom so devastatingly. I love your father, Clara. Please never doubt that. But I am not blind to his weaknesses. He is a man easily swayed by shiny things, by flattery, by the promise of more. And recently, a very shiny, very flattering woman has entered his life. Her name is Evelyn. I gasped. Evelyn had been my father's executive assistant during the last year of my mother's illness. She had been syrupy sweet to me, always bringing me little gifts, telling me how brave I was. My mother had always been polite to her, but I remembered now a certain coolness, a reserve I hadn't understood at the time. She is clever, this woman. She sees your father not as a man to love, but as an empire to conquer. And you, my darling, are a threat to her ambition. She will try to paint you as difficult, as ungrateful, as distant. She will slowly and methodically poison your father against you, isolating him until her voice is the only one he hears. I have seen her do it already, in small ways. A misinterpreted comment here, a forgotten message there. It is a slow, insidious siege, and I fear that after I am gone, the walls around his heart will not be strong enough to hold. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the pages. It was all there. My mother had laid out Evelyn's entire playbook a decade before it had come to pass. The validation was a painful, exquisite relief. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the growing distance. It had been engineered. So, I am leaving you this, my daughter. Not a fortune, but something more important. The truth, and with it, a fighting chance. Your father believes his wealth is his own, built by his hand alone. He has forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, where the seed money came from. Your grandfather, my father, was a very careful man. When he passed, he left his entire estate to me. It wasn't a staggering amount, but it was significant enough to be the entire initial investment in Sterling Enterprises. Your father was a brilliant businessman, but he started with my family's money. I sat bolt upright, the wine forgotten. I had never known this. My father's story was always one of the self-made man, the bootstrap entrepreneur. He'd never once mentioned my maternal grandfather's inheritance being the foundation of his empire. We were married, and what was mine became ours. But my father was a lawyer, and he was wary. He insisted we sign a post-nuptial agreement, not out of distrust for Richard then, but as a safeguard for the future. This document stipulates that in the event of his death, 51% of the initial investment, plus its appreciated value over the years, is to be held in a separate trust. That trust, Clara, is in your name. It was my legacy, intended to pass directly to my child. It is not part of his marital estate. It is not his to give away in a will. It is, and always has been, legally yours. I read the paragraph again and then a third time, my mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what it said. A trust, a legally binding document that superseded his will. I wasn't disinherited. I was the majority shareholder. The ground shifted beneath me. The entire narrative of my life, of my father's life, had just been rewritten. He hadn't just left me out of his will. He had tried to steal my mother's legacy from me. And Evelyn, I was certain, was the architect of the entire scheme. The documents are safe, my love. Your father does not know of them. He thought the agreement was a mere formality that had long since been forgotten. I have enclosed the name and address of my father's old law partner, a man of unimpeachable integrity named Arthur Davies. He holds the original copies in his firm's vault. The key to a safe deposit box at First National Bank is also enclosed. Inside that box, you will find my original diaries from that year, which detail all our financial discussions. It is your proof. Go to him. Show him this letter. Do not be afraid. You are my daughter. You have a lion's heart, even if you don't always know it. Fight for what is yours, Clara. Not for the money, but for the truth. For my memory. Know that I am always with you. All my love. Forever. Mom. I sat there for a long time, the letter clutched in my hands, the small, ornate silver key resting on the table beside it. The tears had stopped. The grief was still there, a deep, aching wound, but it was now mingled with a new, unfamiliar feeling, a cold, clear, righteous anger. My mother hadn't just left me a letter. She had left me a sword and a shield. She had given me back my story, my voice. And as the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, I made a promise to her, to myself. I would not let them get away with it. The fight was on. The morning after I read the letter, the world looked different. The gray fog of my grief had been burned away by the white-hot fire of purpose. My mother's words had not only armed me with the truth, they had reignited a part of myself I thought had been extinguished forever. My resilience. I was no longer Clara, the forgotten daughter, the victim of a cruel will. I was Eleanor's daughter, and I had a mission. My first step was the bank. I clutched the small silver key in my pocket, its sharp edges a constant, tangible reminder of what was at stake. Walking into the downtown branch of First National Bank felt surreal. This was a place of quiet transactions and hushed tones. Yet for me, it felt like the first battlefield. I was terrified that Evelyn might have somehow anticipated this, that she had already cleared out the box or blocked my access. Every smiling teller seemed to be watching me with suspicion. My heart pounded a nervous rhythm as I was led by a stern-faced manager into the vault, a cavern of gleaming steel and silent secrets. The manager used his key, then I slid mine into the lock. The click of the mechanism turning was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I pulled out the long, narrow metal box, my hands trembling as I carried it to a private viewing room. I closed the door, took a deep breath, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 5 leather-bound diaries. They were my mother's, her distinctive script marking the years on each spine. I opened the one for the year Sterling Enterprises was founded. Her entries were meticulous, detailing conversations with her father, the lawyer, and with my own father, Richard. She wrote about her excitement for his new venture, but also her quiet insistence on the post-nuptial agreement. "Richard thinks it's morbid," one entry read, "but Papa is firm. He says it's not about love, it's about legacy. This money is for Clara's future, no matter what happens." Richard finally agreed, calling it my little safety net. "He doesn't understand. This isn't a net, it's an anchor." It was all there. Undeniable proof, in her own words, of the agreement's intent. I carefully packed the diaries into my tote bag, which now felt heavier than a bag of gold. My next step was to contact the lawyer, Arthur Davies. The address my mother had provided was for a small, old-fashioned firm in a historic part of the city, the kind with brass plaques and oak doors. It was a world away from the sleek, modern offices of Mr. Albright. This felt like a good sign. I called the number, and a polite secretary answered. When I asked for Mr. Davies, however, my heart sank. "I'm so sorry," she said kindly. "Mr. Davies retired over 5 years ago. He moved to a retirement community in Florida." A wave of panic washed over me. This was the one man my mother had trusted. Without him, would the documents even be accessible? Would anyone even believe me? I stammered, asking if there was anyone else at the firm who had taken over his files. "Of course," she said. "His son, Samuel Davies, now runs the practice. Would you like to make an appointment?" It was a slim thread of hope, but I clung to it. I booked an appointment for the following afternoon. The next 24 hours were agonizing. I kept the diaries hidden in my apartment, jumping at every creak and groan of the building, half expecting Mark to burst through the door and snatch them away. My imagination ran wild. Had my father told Evelyn about the agreement in a moment of confidence? Was this why they were so smug, so certain? Because they believed they had already found a way to invalidate it? The next day, as I was getting ready to leave for the appointment, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Clara, darling," Evelyn's voice, smooth as silk and just as suffocating, filled my ear. "I was just thinking of you. How are you holding up?" The calculated casualness of it set my teeth on edge. "I'm fine, Evelyn," I said, my voice colder than I intended. Good, she cooed. "Listen, Mark and I were just going through some of your father's old things, and we were thinking it was perhaps a bit harsh, the way the will was worded. We want to do the right thing. We'd like to offer you a small settlement, say $50,000, just to help you get on your feet. A little something to remember your father by." $50,000. It sounded like a fortune, but I knew it was a pittance, a crumb from the multi-million-dollar table they had just inherited. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a trap. They were trying to buy my silence. It was a test. They must have suspected something. Maybe they'd been notified that the safe deposit box had been accessed. Or maybe this was just Evelyn, tying up loose ends, ensuring the little forgotten daughter wouldn't make a fuss. "No, thank you, Evelyn," I said, my voice steady now, infused with the courage my mother's letter had given me. There was a pause on the other end. When she spoke again, the silk was gone, and her voice was pure steel. "I see. I would think very carefully about that decision, Clara. It's a very generous offer. It would be a shame for you to end up with, well, you know." The threat was unmistakable. End up with nothing. "I have to go, Evelyn," I said, and I hung up before she could say another word. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. She knew, Or at least, she suspected. The race had begun. I walked into the law offices of Davies and Son feeling like I was walking into the ring for the most important fight of my life. Samuel Davies was the opposite of what I expected. He wasn't a dusty old man like his father must have been. He was in his late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened patiently as I laid out the entire story, from the reading of the will to the discovery of the letter and Evelyn's phone call. I pushed the letter, the key, and my mother's diaries across his desk. He read the letter first, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up one of the diaries, his eyebrows raising slightly as he scanned the pages. For a long time he was silent, his gaze distant. Finally he looked at me, a new respect in his eyes. "My father spoke of your mother often," he said, his voice quiet. He said she was one of the sharpest, most perceptive women he'd ever met. He called her the gentle lioness. He tapped the letter. It seems he was right. He stood up and walked to a large filing cabinet against the wall. My father was a man of immense foresight. When he retired, he left specific instructions for certain sealed files. Your mother's was one of them. He pulled out a thick, dust-covered folder, bound with a faded red ribbon. On the front, in his father's spidery script, were the words, "Sterling, Aliner, eyes only, S. Davies. In the event of inquiry by Clara Sterling." He cut the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside was the original signed copy of the postnuptial agreement, and tucked in with it was another sealed envelope. Samuel opened it carefully. It contained a signed affidavit from his father, Arthur Davies, dated the week my mother died. It attested to her state of mind when creating the trust and reaffirmed her explicit instructions that it was to be kept secret from my father, Richard, as she feared he would be subject to undue influence after her passing. My mother hadn't just left me a map. She had built me a fortress. Samuel Davies looked at me, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Well, Miss Sterling," he said. The respect in his voice now mingled with the thrill of the fight. "It appears your stepmother has made a critical error." She thought she was playing checkers. He held up the thick legal document. "She had no idea your mother was playing chess." Leaving Samuel Davies's office was like stepping out of a black and white world into one of vibrant color. For the first time since my father's death, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. The fear and uncertainty that had been my constant companions were replaced by a powerful, surging sense of determination. I wasn't just fighting for money or a house. I was fighting for my mother's memory, for the truth she had so carefully preserved for me. I was her lioness now. Samuel, or Sam, as he insisted I call him, was a whirlwind of calm, methodical action. He immediately filed a petition with the probate court to freeze all of my father's assets, citing the discovery of new, superseding legal documents. This, he explained, was the first shot across the bow. It would prevent Evelyn from selling the house, liquidating the stocks, or moving money to offshore accounts before we could make our claim. "She's going to get this notice tomorrow morning," Sam explained over the phone that evening, his voice crisp with energy. "And she is not going to be happy. Prepare yourself, Clara. The polite phone calls are over. The real battle is about to begin." He was right. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7 a.m. It was Mark. I let it go to voicemail. His message was a string of furious, almost incoherent sputtering. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Clara? You're freezing Dad's accounts? After everything he did for you? You ungrateful little—" I deleted the message before he could finish. Minutes later, Evelyn called. I let her go to voicemail, too. Her message was a masterclass in controlled fury. "Clara, I have just received a most peculiar notice from my attorney." Her voice was glacial. "I can only assume this is some kind of terrible misunderstanding, driven by your grief. You need to call your little lawyer and stop this nonsense immediately. You are playing with fire, and you have no idea what you're up against. This is your one and only warning." Oh, the threat was clear, but it didn't scare me. It energized me. It was the sound of a queen realizing her castle was under siege. Sam had advised me not to engage with them directly. "Let them talk to me," he'd said. "Everything they say to you can be twisted. Everything they say to me is on the record." The next few weeks were a flurry of legal activity. Sam and his team worked tirelessly, poring over decades of financial records from Sterling Enterprises. What they uncovered was staggering. My mother's initial investment, once its appreciated value was calculated, didn't just account for 51% of the company. It accounted for nearly 70%. My father had made some risky, leveraged bets over the years, diluting his own stake while my mother's initial foundational capital continued to grow in value. "He wasn't just a brilliant businessman, Clara," Sam told me during one of our meetings, his office now feeling like my command center. "He was a gambler, and he was gambling with your mother's legacy. He treated the entire company as his personal piggy bank, leveraging its assets for personal projects, including buying Evelyn that ridiculous penthouse in the city and funding Mark's series of failed startups. Every new revelation was another layer of betrayal peeled back. My father hadn't just written me out of his will. He had actively squandered the fortune my mother had intended for me, treating it as his own to burn. Evelyn wasn't just a greedy stepmother. She was a willing accomplice, a parasite who had bled the company dry for her own lavish lifestyle. The emotional toll was immense. Some days, I felt invincible, fueled by righteous anger. Other days, I would sit in my quiet bakery after closing, the smell of cooling bread around me, and I would just cry. I cried for the father I thought I had, for the years of lies, for the mother who had been forced to protect her child from her own husband. During this time, I found an unexpected source of strength. One evening, an elderly woman came into the bakery just as I was about to close. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You're Eleanor's girl, aren't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, surprised. "I'm Martha," she said. "I was in your mother's book club for years. She talked about you all the time. She was so proud of you." Tears welled in my eyes. Martha patted my hand. "We've all read about what's happening in the papers," she said, her voice full of compassion. "Your mother was a strong woman, dear. She wouldn't want you to give up." It turned out my mother's old friends, her book club, her gardening circle, had been following the story. They had seen through Evelyn's society page facade from the very beginning. They started stopping by the bakery, one by one, bringing old photos of my mother, sharing stories, offering a cup of coffee and a listening ear. They became my quiet army of support, a circle of warmth and strength that reminded me who I was fighting for. They were the keepers of my mother's memory, and they would not let it be tarnished. Meanwhile, Evelyn and Mark had hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers from a top-tier firm. Their first move was to contest the validity of the post-nuptial agreement. They claimed my father had signed it under duress, that my grandfather had bullied him into it. They painted my mother as a manipulative heiress, and my grandfather as a domineering patriarch. They were trying to rewrite history, to slander the very people they had robbed. "This is standard procedure," Sam assured me, his calm a steady anchor in the storm. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But they have a problem. We have your grandfather's lawyer's affidavit. We have your mother's diaries. Their narrative is built on lies, and lies have a way of falling apart under pressure." The pressure was mounting. The preliminary court date was set. Evelyn's lawyers filed motion after motion to delay, to bury us in paperwork, to bleed me dry financially. I had to pour my life savings into the legal fund. There were nights I lay awake, terrified that I had made a terrible mistake, that I would lose everything, my bakery included, and end up with even less than nothing. It was during one of these dark moments that Sam called me. "I think we've found something, Clara," he said, a note of excitement in his voice. Something big. My paralegal was digging through the company's incorporation documents. "Do you remember the name of your mother's childhood dog?" The question was so bizarre it jolted me out of my anxiety. "Of course," I said. It was a golden retriever named Jasper. I thought so, Sam said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. It turns out, when your mother set up the trust, she included a very specific, very personal fail-safe clause. She stipulated that any major changes to the corporate structure or the trust itself would require a password-like confirmation, a piece of information only she and a trusted few would know. The fail-safe question is, what was the name of my first and most loyal companion? The answer, of course, is Jasper. Your father never knew the dog. Evelyn certainly wouldn't. It's a lock that only you, or someone who truly knew your mother, could open. I sank into my chair, breathless. My mother, the puzzle lover, the secret keeper, had left one final brilliant clue. She had protected her legacy not just with law, but with love. Evelyn's lawyers are trying to claim the trust was amended years later by your father, Sam continued, his voice hardening. They're about to produce a document to prove it, but I have a feeling they're going to have a very hard time explaining how your father knew the name of a dog that passed away before he even met your mother. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. Evelyn thought she had the king cornered, but she had no idea my mother had a hidden queen, waiting to make the final, decisive move. The discovery of the Jasper clause was a turning point. It shifted the dynamic from a defensive battle to a strategic offensive. Sam Davies was practically giddy with the legal implications. It wasn't just a charming personal detail. It was a verifiable, unforgeable security measure that my mother had ingeniously woven into the legal framework of the trust. It was a fingerprint from the past that no one but me could identify. With this new weapon in our arsenal, Sam's team began to dig with renewed vigor. They subpoenaed years of financial records, communication logs, and corporate meeting minutes from Sterling Enterprises. The sheer volume of paperwork was overwhelming, but within that mountain of data, a dark and detailed picture of deception began to emerge. It was worse than we had imagined. The first major revelation came from the company's expense reports. Evelyn, under the guise of corporate consulting and client entertainment, had been systematically draining company funds for years. We found receipts for 5-figure shopping sprees on Rodeo Drive, invoices for lavish European vacations for her and Mark, and a monthly stipend paid to a shell corporation that we traced back to her personal bank account. She hadn't just been living off my father's generosity. She had been actively embezzling from the company, my mother's company. Then came the analysis of the business itself. My father, in his later years and heavily influenced by Mark, had made a series of disastrous business decisions. He had sold off profitable, stable divisions of the company to fund Mark's flashy but vapid tech startups, each of which had burned through cash before spectacularly imploding. They had been treating Sterling Enterprises not as a legacy to be preserved, but as a personal ATM with no withdrawal limit. They weren't just incompetent, they were reckless, systematically dismantling the very foundation of the wealth they were so desperate to claim. They were running it into the ground, Clara, Sam said, his face grim as he showed me a chart detailing the company's declining profits. If they had maintained control for another 5 years, there might not have been much of an estate left to fight over. In a strange way, your father's passing may have been the only thing that could save your mother's company from his own family. The irony was bitter and profound. The emotional weight of these discoveries was crushing. Each document was a fresh betrayal. I saw my father not as the strong, infallible businessman of my childhood, but as a man weakened by age, grief, and the constant manipulative whispers of a woman who preyed on his vanities. I saw Mark not as a misguided stepbrother, but as a feckless, entitled leech who saw my father's love as a resource to be exploited. My little bakery became my sanctuary. The simple, honest work of kneading dough, of creating something good and real with my own hands, kept me sane. The quiet support of my mother's friends was a constant comfort. They would come in, not to pry or gossip, but to share a memory, to remind me that my mother's light hadn't been extinguished, that it lived on in the people who had loved her. One afternoon, Martha, the book club friend, brought in a framed photo. It was a picture of my mother and me at the Lake Tahoe cabin, both of us laughing, our faces bright with sunshine. "Eleanor gave this to me," Martha said. "She said it was her favorite picture because it captured pure joy. I think she'd want you to have it back now." I hung it behind the counter, a daily reminder of what I was fighting for. As our case grew stronger, the attacks from Evelyn's side grew more desperate and personal. Their lawyers began a smear campaign, leaking fabricated stories to gossip columnists. One article painted me as a bitter, money-hungry daughter who had been estranged from her father for years due to her unstable behavior. Another suggested I was being manipulated by an unscrupulous lawyer looking for a big payday. They were trying to discredit me in the court of public opinion, to make me look like the villain. It hurt, deeply. Strangers would look at me on the street with suspicion. My bakery's online reviews were suddenly flooded with one-star ratings from fake accounts, accusing me of poor hygiene and terrible service. It was a coordinated, vicious attack designed to break my spirit. I called Sam in a panic, reading him one of the hateful articles. "How can they just print these lies?" I cried, my voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "It's a sign of weakness, Clara," he said, his voice a calm, reassuring presence. "They're losing the legal battle, so they're resorting to mudslinging. Don't engage. Don't respond. We stay focused on the facts. The truth is our only weapon, and it's more powerful than any lie they can print." He was right. I had to build a wall around my heart to let the lies bounce off while I held tight to the truth my mother had given me. The day came when Evelyn's lawyers played their hand. As Sam had predicted, they filed a motion presenting a newly discovered amendment to the trust. It was dated 5 years after my mother's death and was supposedly signed by my father. The document purported to dissolve the original trust and absorb all its assets into his general estate. It was, on the surface, a silver bullet that would destroy our entire case. Accompanying it was a signed statement from my father's financial advisor at the time, a man named Mr. Peterson, attesting to the document's authenticity. "They're confident," Sam said as he reviewed the documents they'd sent over. "Too confident. This document looks perfect. The signature is a flawless imitation of your father's." A cold dread washed over me. "What does this mean, Sam? Can they do this? Can they win?" Sam leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful, almost predatory look in his eyes. "It means they've just handed us the rope to hang them with," he said slowly. "They've created a forgery. A very good one, I'll admit, but a forgery nonetheless. And they've made a critical mistake." "What mistake?" I asked, leaning forward, my heart pounding. He tapped the document with his pen. "This amendment, which supposedly dissolves the trust, makes no mention of the Jasper failsafe. In order to legally amend the trust my mother set up, the amending document itself would have had to include the correct answer to her security question to prove the amender had the authority to do so. This document doesn't. It's like they picked a complicated lock on the front door, but they had no idea there was a second, hidden deadbolt that only we have the key for." A slow smile spread across my face. "So they've legally admitted they didn't have the authority to change it." "Exactly," Sam confirmed. "And what's more, they've now committed fraud and perjury by submitting a forged document and a false affidavit to the court. This has just escalated from a civil dispute over an inheritance to a potential criminal case. They thought this was their checkmate, Clara, but they just tipped over their own king." The stage was set for the final confrontation. They had built their entire strategy around a lie, a beautiful, convincing lie. And we had one small, simple, unassailable truth, embodied by the name of a long-lost golden retriever. The submission of the forged amendment was a declaration of all-out war. It was no longer a legal disagreement. It was a high-stakes gamble, and Evelyn had just pushed all her chips to the center of the table. The atmosphere grew thick with tension as we prepared for the next court hearing, where this very document would be the centerpiece of their argument. A few days before the hearing, I received an unexpected visitor at the bakery. It was Mark. I was in the back, pulling a tray of croissants from the oven, when my young assistant, Sarah, came in, her eyes wide. "There's a man here to see you," she whispered. "He says his name is Mark Jennings." My stomach turned to ice. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Tell him we're closed," I said, my voice tight. "I tried," Sarah said, wringing her hands. "He won't leave. He says it's urgent." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Sam's voice echoed in my head. "Don't engage." But this was my territory, my sanctuary. I would not be intimidated here. I walked out to the front of the shop. Mark was standing there, looking awkward and out of place amidst the scent of sugar and yeast. He was wearing an expensive suit that looked rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a strained, nervous energy. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice flat. I stood behind the counter, creating a physical barrier between us. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, Clara," he began, not meeting my eyes. "This has all gone too far. My mother, she's very upset. We didn't want it to come to this." "Didn't want what to come to this, Mark?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Didn't want to get caught forging legal documents? Or didn't want me to fight back when you tried to steal my mother's entire legacy?" He flinched, finally looking up at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, panic, maybe even a sliver of shame. "It's not like that," he mumbled. "Dad wanted us to be taken care of. He knew you were fine. You have this place." He gestured vaguely at my bakery, as if it were a quaint little hobby and not the business I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into for years. The condescension was breathtaking. "This place," I said, my voice rising, "is something I built myself, with my own 2 hands. Not with stolen money, Mark. Not by erasing someone from my family." He took a step closer to the counter. "Okay, look. Mom sent me. She wants to make this go away. We're prepared to raise our offer. Substantially." He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. $300,000, tax-free. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, drop this insane lawsuit, and we all walk away and never have to see each other again. It was a life-changing amount of money. A year ago, I would have fainted at the sight of that number. But now, it felt like an insult. It was hush money. It was the price they were putting on my mother's memory, on the truth. They weren't offering it out of generosity. They were offering it out of fear. They knew their forgery was a weak point, and they were trying to buy their way out of the consequences. I looked at the piece of paper. Then I looked at Mark, at his tired, desperate face. And for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a weak, spoiled man who had been propped up his entire life by his mother and my father's money, and who was now terrified that the props were about to be kicked out from under him. I pushed the paper back across the counter. "The answer is no," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. Mark stared at me, his mouth agape. "Are you crazy?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you're turning down? This is your last chance, Clara. My mother is not going to offer again. When we win in court, you get nothing. Again." "It's not about the money anymore, Mark," I said softly. "It never really was. It's about what's right. Your mother and my father made a choice to lie, to steal, and to try to erase me. Now I'm making my choice. I choose to fight." His face hardened then, the brief flicker of desperation replaced by his familiar, ugly arrogance. "Fine," he spat, snatching the paper off the counter. "Have it your way. But don't come crying to us when you're bankrupt and alone. We tried to be reasonable. My mother tried to be kind. You'll regret this." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the bakery, the little bell on the door jangling furiously in his wake. I stood there for a long moment, my body trembling with adrenaline. Sarah came out from the back, her face pale. "Are you okay?" she asked. I took a deep, shuddering breath and a slow smile spread across my face. "I'm better than okay, Sarah," I said. "I think we just confirmed they're terrified. When I told Sam about the visit, he was ecstatic. "They're blinking, Clara. That was a desperation move. They know the amendment is a gamble, and they tried to buy their way out." This is excellent news. But the confrontation wasn't over. The next day, I had another visitor. This one I was not expecting. It was Mr. Peterson, the financial advisor who had signed the affidavit supporting the forged amendment. He was an older man, stooped and frail, and his face was etched with worry. He came into the bakery and simply stood there, holding his hat in his hands, until I approached him. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to talk to you. I made a terrible mistake." We sat at a small table in the corner, and he told me the whole story. He had been my father's advisor for over 30 years. After my father's death, Evelyn had come to him. She had told him that I was unstable, that I was trying to contest a will that was clearly my father's wishes, and that she needed his help to protect the estate. She had presented him with the amendment, and he, trusting the woman he saw as my father's grieving widow, had signed the affidavit. "She was so convincing," he said, his eyes filled with tears of regret. "She said it was just a formality, to finalize some paperwork Richard had been working on before he passed. I never questioned it. Richard was my friend. I thought I was helping his family. But then," he said, "our legal team had subpoenaed him for a deposition. He had started to review his old files to prepare, and he had found his notes from the year in question. There was no mention of any trust amendment. In fact, there were notes about a conversation where my father had casually mentioned my mother's ironclad trust for me, laughing it off as something he couldn't touch even if he wanted to." "I realized I'd been played," Mr. Peterson confessed, his voice breaking. "That document, it's a fraud, and I attached my name to it. My reputation, my career, it's all on the line. But that's not why I'm here." He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze full of a painful sincerity. "I'm here because I respected your mother. She was a fine woman, and I will not be a party to this desecration of her memory. I am prepared to testify in court and tell the judge the entire truth about how Evelyn manipulated me into signing that affidavit." This was it. This was the final piece of the puzzle. We didn't just have circumstantial evidence that the document was a forgery. We now had a first-hand witness, their own star witness, ready to flip and expose their entire conspiracy. The trap they had so carefully set for me was about to snap shut on them. Mr. Peterson's confession was the bombshell we had been waiting for. It was one thing for us to claim the document was a forgery. It was another thing entirely to have their own hand-picked witness ready to testify that he was manipulated into signing it. Sam Davies was like a kid on Christmas morning. He immediately took a formal, videotaped deposition from Mr. Peterson, securing his testimony under oath. The man was clearly terrified of the professional repercussions, but his conscience had won out. His loyalty to my parents' memory was stronger than his fear of Evelyn. We made a strategic decision not to reveal our new ace. We let Evelyn and her high-priced legal team walk into the final hearing believing they held the winning card. We knew they would build their entire closing argument around the amendment, and we wanted them to walk as far out onto that limb as possible before we sawed it off behind them. The days leading up to the hearing were the most intense of my life. I barely slept, my mind racing with every possible scenario. My little bakery, once a place of peaceful creation, now felt like a war room. My mother's friends would stop by daily, not with questions, but with quiet offerings of support, a thermos of hot coffee, a plate of cookies, a simple, "We're thinking of you." Their unwavering faith was a rock I clung to in the swirling storm of my anxiety. The night before the hearing, I found myself in the attic of my parents' old house one last time. Sam had arranged for a final walkthrough to gather some of my mother's personal effects that had been previously overlooked. As I was packing a box of her old photo albums, I found a small, leather-bound book tucked away at the bottom of a trunk. It wasn't a diary. It was a day planner from the year she passed away. Most of the pages were blank, her illness having curtailed her once busy life. But on one page, dated just 2 weeks before she died, she had written a short entry. "Spoke with Arthur D. today," finalized the failsafe. "He thought it was a brilliant touch. Said no one would ever think of it. My sweet Jasper. Always protecting his girl, even now. I feel at peace knowing Clara is safe. Whatever storms may come, she will have an anchor." Tears streamed down my cheeks. It was a final, loving message of reassurance. She had known. She had faced her own mortality not with fear, but with a fierce, protective love that transcended time and even death itself. She had spent her final days ensuring I would be safe. I carefully tore the page from the planner and tucked it into my wallet. It was my shield. The day of the hearing arrived, gray and overcast, a perfect reflection of my mood. The courtroom was packed. The story had become a minor local sensation, a classic David versus Goliath tale. I saw my mother's friends, Martha and the others, sitting in the public gallery, a silent chorus of support. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Sam, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, Evelyn, Mark, and their team of lawyers looked supremely confident. Evelyn even gave me a small, condescending nod, a final gesture of pity for the little fool who didn't know when she was beaten. Their lawyer began his closing argument. He was smooth, charismatic, and utterly convincing. He painted a picture of a loving, generous father who, in his wisdom, had decided to consolidate his estate for the sake of simplicity and fairness. He held up the forged amendment, referring to it as the final, definitive expression of Richard Sterling's wishes. "This document," he declared, his voice booming through the courtroom, "signed by Mr. Sterling and authenticated by his trusted financial advisor of 30 years, Mr. Peterson, proves beyond any doubt that the trust in question was legally dissolved. The plaintiff's claims, while fueled by understandable grief, are based on outdated documents and wishful thinking. The facts, Your Honor, are written here in black and white." He then called his star witness, Mr. Peterson, to the stand. I saw Evelyn give Mr. Peterson a small, encouraging smile as he walked past her. She had no idea he was a Trojan horse, about to burn her city to the ground. Mr. Peterson took the stand, looking frail but resolute. Evelyn's lawyer began with a few simple questions, establishing his long-standing relationship with my father. "And Mr. Peterson," the lawyer said, moving in for the kill, "can you confirm for the court that you witnessed Richard Sterling sign this amendment and that you signed the accompanying affidavit attesting to its authenticity?" He held up the document. The room was silent. I held my breath. Mr. Peterson looked not at the lawyer, but directly at the judge. He took a deep, steadying breath. "No, sir, I cannot," he said, his voice clear and firm. A confused murmur rippled through the courtroom. Evelyn's lawyer froze, his confident smile faltering. I beg your pardon?" he stammered. "The signature on that affidavit is mine," Mr. Peterson continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "But I was misled into signing it. Mrs. Evelyn Sterling came to me under false pretenses, telling me the document was a simple formality to settle her late husband's affairs. I did not witness Richard Sterling sign that amendment. In fact, based on my own records and my long history with Mr. Sterling, I have every reason to believe that this document is a complete and utter forgery." The word forgery exploded in the courtroom. Evelyn shot to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "He's lying!" she shrieked. "He's been bought! This is a conspiracy!" The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Mrs. Sterling, sit down immediately or you will be held in contempt." But the damage was done. Their entire case, built on the foundation of this one document, had just crumbled into dust. Sam stood up, his face a mask of calm, professional satisfaction. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "in light of Mr. Peterson's testimony, we would like to present one final piece of evidence." He walked to the witness stand and handed Mr. Peterson the page I had found from my mother's day planner. "Mr. Peterson, as my father's trusted advisor, can you identify the handwriting on this page? Mr. Peterson looked at the page, and his face softened. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That is Eleanor Sterling's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere. And would you please read the entry aloud for the court? Sam asked. He read my mother's final words about the Jasper failsafe. As he spoke, a profound silence fell over the room. It was as if my mother herself were there, speaking the truth from beyond the grave. The elegant, simple security measure she had created, born of a mother's love and a dog's memory, was the final, irrefutable proof. The forged amendment made no mention of it, because the forgers had no idea it even existed. When he finished reading, Sam turned to face Evelyn, whose face had gone ashen. Mrs. Sterling, he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Perhaps you can tell the court the name of your late husband's mother-in-law's golden retriever? Evelyn just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. Her perfect, calculated world had shattered around her, and she was left speechless in the wreckage. The trap had been sprung. It was over. The moment Sam Davies asked that question about my grandmother's dog, the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. It was no longer a legal proceeding. It was an execution. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. All eyes were on Evelyn, who looked as if she had been turned to stone. The color had drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a garish mask on a statue. Her lawyer, a man who minutes before had been the picture of slick confidence, now just shuffled his papers, avoiding everyone's gaze. He knew, as we all did, that the game was up. The judge, a man whose expression had been stern and impassive throughout the trial, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. "Well, Mrs. Sterling?" he prompted, his voice laced with a new, sharp edge of impatience. "Can you answer the question?" Evelyn's composure finally, spectacularly, broke. She turned to her lawyer, her whisper a harsh, panicked hiss that was audible throughout the silent room. "Do something! Object! This is ridiculous!" But her lawyer simply shook his head, a gesture of complete surrender. "On what grounds, Evelyn?" he muttered back. "Relevance? The entire validity of your claim hinges on this." Mark, sitting beside her, looked like a cornered animal. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how this could possibly be happening. How could their perfect plan, their airtight case, be undone by a dog? Sam let the silence hang in the air for a few more excruciating seconds before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority, "the plaintiff rests. The evidence speaks for itself. The amendment submitted by the defense is a fraudulent document, created with the sole intent to defraud my client of her rightful inheritance, as stipulated by a legally binding trust set up by her mother, the late Eleanor Sterling. Furthermore, the defense has knowingly submitted this false document to the court, an act of perjury and a serious crime." The judge nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the defense table with undisguised contempt. He looked at Evelyn, Mark, and their defeated lawyer. "I have heard enough," he said, his voice like the crack of a gavel itself. "This court will recess for 1 hour, after which I will deliver my verdict." The hour that followed was the longest of my life. We were ushered into a small waiting room, where I sat huddled with Sam and my mother's friends. Martha held my hand, her grip warm and steady. "She did it, Clara," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "Your mother did it. She protected you." We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. We could only wait. When we were called back into the courtroom, the energy was electric. Evelyn and Mark were already there, no longer seated together. Mark was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. Evelyn sat ramrod straight, her face a rigid mask of fury, her eyes burning holes into the back of my head. The judge entered, and an immediate hush fell over the room. He didn't waste any time. He looked directly at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of warmth, of human compassion in his eyes. "Miss Sterling," he began, his voice formal but clear, "this court has reviewed all the evidence presented, including the powerful and deeply moving testimony of Mr. Peterson and the unique validation methods established by your late mother. It is the finding of this court that the postnuptial agreement and the trust it created are valid and legally binding." A collective gasp went through my little group of supporters. I felt a wave of dizziness, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice hardening as he turned his gaze to the defense, "this court finds that the purported amendment to said trust is a fabrication. It is a fraudulent document, submitted with malicious intent. The actions of Mrs. Evelyn Sterling and Mr. Mark Jennings in this matter are not just unethical, they are illegal." "Oh," Evelyn made a small, strangled sound. "Therefore," the judge declared, his voice rising to a crescendo, "the court orders the following. First, the freeze on the assets of the estate of Richard Sterling will be made permanent until a full accounting can be completed. Second, control of Sterling Enterprises is to be immediately transferred to the legally established trust under the stewardship of its sole beneficiary, Miss Clara Sterling. I was the head of the company, my mother's company." The words barely registered. It was too much to comprehend. "Third," and here the judge's voice dropped, becoming grave and serious, "given the overwhelming evidence of fraud, perjury, and potential embezzlement, this court is referring this entire case to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation." That was the final blow. The sound that escaped Evelyn's throat was a raw, animalistic cry of pure despair. This wasn't just about losing the money anymore. This was about losing her freedom. She and Mark were facing jail time. The judge slammed his gavel down. The sound was a definitive, resounding crack of justice. "This court is adjourned." As people began to stir, a surreal scene unfolded. Two bailiffs approached the defense table. Evelyn began to scream, a tirade of vitriol and denial. "You can't do this to me! I am Mrs. Richard Sterling! I have rights!" Mark just sat there, completely catatonic, his face pale and slack. The bailiffs had to help him to his feet. Reporters, who had been scenting blood for weeks, swarmed forward, cameras flashing, microphones being thrust into Evelyn's screaming face. The perfect, poised socialite was gone, replaced by a cornered, screeching harpy, her downfall being broadcast for the entire world to see. It was a brutal, public, and utterly complete humiliation. I watched them being led away, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary sadness. I saw my father's face in Mark's defeated posture, and I felt a pang of pity for the weak man he had become. I saw the empty shell of a woman in Evelyn, a person so consumed by greed that she had destroyed everything, including herself. My mother's friends surrounded me, hugging me, crying tears of joy and relief. Sam shook my hand, his face beaming. "We did it, Clara," he said. "We truly did it." Oh, I walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, which had finally broken through the clouds. I felt light, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The fight was over. The lies had been exposed. The truth had won. My mother's memory had been honored. I took a deep breath of the clean, fresh air, and for the first time in a very long time I felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I would face it as my mother had intended, as the head of her legacy, with a lion's heart, anchored by her unending love. In the weeks and months that followed the verdict, the world slowly settled back onto its axis, but it was a new world, a different one. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of legal formalities and media attention. The criminal investigation into Evelyn and Mark moved swiftly. Faced with Mr. Peterson's testimony and the mountain of financial evidence Sam's team had uncovered, they had no choice but to plead guilty. Evelyn was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. Mark, due to his lesser role, received a 2-year sentence. Their fall from grace was as spectacular as it was public. The society pages that once fawned over Evelyn's charity galas now detailed her prison sentence in lurid detail. It was a harsh end, but it was a just one. Taking over Sterling Enterprises was the most daunting challenge of my life. I knew how to run a bakery, how to balance the books for a small business. I knew nothing about running a multi-million-dollar corporation. The first few weeks were terrifying. I walked into the sleek, intimidating corporate offices feeling like a complete imposter. The employees looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. I was the baker's daughter, the quiet woman from the papers. What could I possibly know about their world? But Sam Davies was my guide. And more importantly, I had my mother's legacy as my compass. I didn't try to be my father, the gambler and risk-taker. I decided to be my mother, the prudent, thoughtful builder. My first act as CEO was to conduct a full, transparent audit of the company. We cut the wasteful spending, sold the penthouse in the city, and liquidated the portfolio of Mark's failed projects. We focused on strengthening the core, profitable divisions of the company, the ones my father had built in the early days, with my mother's money and support. I also made a point of getting to know the employees, the people whose lives depended on the company's success. I learned their names, their stories. I brought in pastries from my bakery on Fridays. Slowly, the atmosphere in the office began to change. The fear and uncertainty left by my father's reckless management were replaced by a sense of stability and shared purpose. I wasn't the ruthless corporate raider they might have feared. I was just Clara, trying to do the right thing. I never sold my bakery. It was my anchor, my connection to the life I had built for myself. I hired Sarah, my loyal assistant, to manage it day to day. But I still went in on weekends, my hands covered in flour, finding peace in the simple, honest work of creating. It reminded me where I came from and who I was. One of the most important things I did was establish the Eleanor Sterling Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing financial and legal support to victims of elder abuse and inheritance fraud. I used a significant portion of the estate's profits to fund it, ensuring that my mother's story, and my own, could be a source of strength and help for others who found themselves in the same dark, lonely place I had been. Her legacy would not just be a company, it would be a beacon of hope. I went back to the Lake Tahoe cabin. The first visit was difficult. The memories were so thick I could feel them in the air. But I cleared out the dust, aired out the rooms, and filled the space with fresh flowers and the smell of baking apple pie, just like my mother used to. I invited her friends up for a weekend, and we sat on the old porch, sharing stories, laughing, and watching the sunset over the lake. I felt her presence there, not as a sad ghost, but as a warm, loving spirit, finally at peace. The cabin was no longer a painful memory. It was a sanctuary again. I never heard from Mark or Evelyn again, and I never sought them out. Their chapter in my life was closed. Forgiveness was a complicated idea, one I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I found that the best revenge wasn't hatred. It was living a good, happy, and meaningful life, something their greed had made them incapable of. My life now is quiet, but it is full. It is a life of purpose, of honoring the past while building a new future. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in my mother's old office at Sterling Enterprises, looking out over the city, I'll pull the worn page from her day planner out of my wallet. I'll read her final words about her sweet Jasper, about the anchor she left for me. She was wrong about one thing. She said she was leaving me an anchor, something to keep me safe in a storm. But what she really left me was a pair of wings. She gave me the freedom to become the woman I was always meant to be. I am not just the baker's daughter anymore. I am not the disinherited girl from the will. I am Clara Sterling, my mother's daughter, the gentle lioness. And my story, the one she helped me fight for, is a testament to the fact that truth can be buried, but it can never be destroyed, and that a mother's love, true and fierce, is the most powerful legacy of all.